In our last video, we began looking at Lightwave's bone system, and we started out with the good old Z-axis bone. In this video, we're going to move on to look at the joints bone type and how that differs. And to do so, strangely enough, we start with a Z-axis bone. We start with this to show that you can cross-convert back and forth between one type and the other. Also, we wish to show that the joint is slightly different from the bone in a few key ways. One of the main ways being its deformer portion, if you will. You'll notice that when I go to joint, I just have this single circle there. If I add another child joint, however, then what we see is we get this deformer, this bone piece, or whatever you want to call it, formed in between the two joints. We see, of course, if we set them back to Z-axis bones, that there are indeed two of them like this. But whereas the Z-axis has this second deformer portion disappearing off the end there, in the case of using these as joints, it is different. You only have this one deforming piece strung between the two. Something else that is important to note about this difference is the relation between the deformer and the pivot, and also consequently the named item. You'll notice that this first joint here is called bone 1 and this second joint is called bone 2, but when we click to select the deformer portion in the middle, you see that it is also titled bone 2. This deformer isn't a part of this first joint. It is a part of the second. What we see that this means is that when we start to think about how to use joints, we have to go about it in a slightly different way. With Z-axis bones, you have pivot point, deformer, pivot point, deformer. The pivot kind of comes above the deformer, hierarchically speaking, and the deformer exists before the pivot of the next bone. With joints, that of course is backwards, and so in hierarchical terms you have the deformer first and then the pivot second. But of course pivoting this doesn't adjust the orientation of that deformer, rather that deformer is just drawn between wherever the two joints happen to be. So if I rotate this first one, then you get this normal appearing bone rotation effect. But the deformer is not turning along with this joint, rather it is just updating itself to reach this one. And this one, of course, is moving up because it is a child of that one. This also means that your weights go round back to front, as it were. For instance, here we have such a deformer set up in the forearm of a character. Now you can see the name of it, left forearm, is there, but of course that belongs to the joint part, which is here, at the wrist location. Of course that is also named left forearm. They are part of the same structure. So even though this joint is at the wrist, its deformer is actually in the forearm, and so equally the weight map is set for the deformer position, not the joint position. So let's take a look at something else. Here's our plane again, and we're just going to have a couple of single joints in there. These are of course appearing as circles without deformers between them because they are not parented to one another, they're siblings. First of all, let's notice what happens with joints on their own here. We'll notice that they're rested, they're skinned to the mesh and whatnot, but manipulating them seems to be having no effect. You will remember from the last video, I'm sure, that there was the issue of how the rest length of a Z-axis bone influences what vertices it grabs on a mesh, and pretty much the same sort of thing is true here on the joint. In the case of a single joint like this, no rest length exists, or rather it does exist, but it's zero. The result is that having the multiply strength by rest length option turned on for a single joint like this causes it to not function. It effectively has a strength of 0. So if we turn that off for all of these guys here, in a way, these singular joints function like Z-axis bones that have just got a pathetically tiny, almost 0 rest length. You'll notice, of course, that if I start squashing and stretching this joint here, you see that the influence on the mesh is radial around it. It's equal both to the left and right and the up and down here, unlike the Z-axis bone, which of course grabbed within the area of influence of its deformer. So if we parent one of those joints off there, so as we actually get a joint deformer portion formed, then we can see that something different happens. Again, if I scale you now, we see that the area of influence is once again around the deformer. It's behaving more like the Z-axis bone did. What you'll also notice if I drag this child joint out and then re-rest it, is that we have a very similar outcome to that which we had with Z-axis bones. The distance between a parent joint and its child here effectively determines what the rest length of the bone is. You'll notice that for the deformer portion, the rest length with joints is greyed out, it can't be accessed. And that is because the rest length is whatever the distance between two joints is when they are rested, when they are skinned to a mesh. You may also notice as I'm clicking about here between the circular joint parts and the bone-like deformer parts, that the bone properties panel keeps changing. Mostly what you should notice is that when I click this second joint and select it, all of the weight and other deformation options vanish, and they only appear when I either have the first joint selected or this deformer portion here selected. So what else is there here that's interesting to know? Well, we'll see that of course, joints can just be posed in whatever fashion, much like Z bones, through rotations and whatnot. That's fine. However, translation of joints will also have the same effect as posing in that fashion. See, when I move this child joint around, it looks like the parent joint is rotating to point at it. But if you look at its actual rotation handles, you'll see that it is not. This joint has not rotated, and of course, neither has this one. What has happened is this one has translated, and it is the deformer which has rotated in order to make up the space between the two. And this, because it is the deformer which is affecting our mesh, still causes us to have this deformation effect. This is one of the great things that joints can do. You're not simply limited to having to rotate them to produce a deformation effect. You can translate and nudge child joints around as well, which can be a particularly useful and powerful thing to do in certain areas for deformation, as we will of course see in time. This translatability, however, must also be understood and used properly. One quick way of rigging up, say, some kind of deformed skeleton out of joints, or maybe if you wanted to get clever with control mechanisms, you could jump over the rotations and just start snapping joints in the chain positionally to the next point, to the shoulder, to the elbow, to the wrist, and just translate them around, letting the deformers rotate. However, let's take a note here of what happens if you do that too much. I'll bring this child joint up here, and then I'm going to bring it across on the x-axis like this. Watch what happens as we cross over the parent. There we see our mesh flips. Look at that, nasty little pop. Why has it done this, you might wonder? Well, the answer is down to this whole rotation of the joint deformer. If we just switch to bounding box and take a little look at our joint deformer, you see as I'm moving it there, the shading is changing on the actual deformer part. Yep. You'll notice that joints and bones, when they are drawn shaded like this, they shade a little bit darker on their underside and a little bit lighter on their top side. When I say top side, that would be the side that had the bank pointing up when it was back at rest. What we're seeing here is something that's kind of non too dissimilar to what we've seen in the target and pole videos, where once you crossed over and you would get a flip, and so you would have to have a pole item to pull the third axis back around. It almost looks as if we've got a null and another null and something targeting between them, and this is that little flip that we get in targeting. And it looks a lot like that because that is pretty much what you do have. This deformer portion doesn't just work by magic, it is still working off of the whole base Lightwave system. It is rotating around in the space of this parent item, and it is still using Lightwave's normal rotational methods, and as such it is prone to gimbal lock and flip and so on. That means if you try and set up, say, an elbow on a character using just position to drag the joints around, then when you turn it past 90 degrees you're going to get a flip, which basically means it's a technique that you can't use because there is no way to take over the rotational control of this deformer portion. Can't be done. Therefore, translating joints around in this fashion to create bending deformations is not a good technique to use. Rather, you will still want to treat them very much like bones or other items, where you rotate the parent rather than translate the child. The translation of children that you can get little effects out of is helpful for more secondary deformation effects, or effects where things don't need to bend very far. It saves you from having to use an extra bone or an extra piece of hierarchy or some other kind of control system. You've essentially just got it there built in the joint, ready to be accessed. But when doing so, you must remember it's for smaller effects rather than grander ones. The other thing that we'll notice with the translation like this that can be done is how it relates to squashing and stretching of a mesh. You can see that what it appears to do, one of the things that is thought about joints, is that they make squash and stretch deformation much more easy. To an extent they do. They create a better effect than you would get with Z bones. If we just convert these guys both back a brief second, then we can see that with this Z bone here, obviously we're getting a very different effect. The mesh is pulling apart between the two. However, as joints, the mesh is spacing out more between the two. But this is still not stretch. You'll notice if I come back here, you see how our lines on the mesh there are starting to overlap with previous rows. The reason for this is because this action is not stretching the bone, it is moving it. And so these vertices are being moved. They are not being stretched, they are not being scaled. If you want to do proper stretching effects with joints, then just like Z bones, you have to take the parent and stretch it. That will give you correct stretchy effects. Simply translating the child will not. The other very worthwhile thing to be taken note of are the joint compensation options. Let me just turn on compensation and for parent there. And we'll notice that rotated like this on pitch, I'm getting the same compensated effect here. Again, notice the link to the backwardness of the joint deformer relationship. Even though this joint is the same bone as this deformer, it is this deformer that the joint and parent compensation checkboxes have to be checked upon in order to work across this joint. So there's that. The important thing to notice, however, is that this doesn't just work on pitch for joints, it will also work on heading or any other axis if there were many other axes around. So to that extent you get the ability of not having to only use a single axis for the rotation. For instance, with Z bones you might be in a situation where you want to use the compensation, but that requires the thing to turn on pitch, and maybe that's going to cause a flip or something else because you'd prefer to use heading as the major axis for that bone, but the fact that you want this effect means you can't. Joints offer a great solution to that. And just like Z bones, you'll notice that things like the bulge and whatnot still happen in the axis of rotation. Something that you have to take note of with using joints in Lightwave and using the joint compensation options is a small bug that's been in here since joints were introduced. You notice here this is just the rest position of this tube. It's not been deformed by these joints into this shape. So maybe this is, I don't know, a foot or something, you know, you've got a leg, a foot, it's backwards, but anyway. You'll notice that if I turn on joint comp for parent, it twists straight away. It does this effect, which it should not do. If these were Z bones, which of course I can make them into, then of course the joint comp options don't change anything because this is the based rest position for the bones. What Z bones look at is the actual angle that a bone is turned to from its rest position. Joints, unfortunately, just see rotation between one joint and the next. They don't see the rested version of it. So if this were some L shape in a piece of geometry at an ankle or whatnot, and you decide you want to use the joint compensation, as soon as you turn it on, your rest pose becomes deformed, which of course you don't want. Same of course for the muscle flexing options and whatnot. This is quite an annoying bug, unfortunately. I wish it had been fixed a long time ago, but still no movement on that. However, there is a little fix workaround that you can do for it. Once you've set up your rig and your joints and you've turned on the compensation options that you do want, you can select the object and choose Save Endomorph. I'm going to give this just a name there, I'll call it Base Pose. What you're then able to do is open up the object's properties and apply the base pose morph at negative 100%. And that pretty much gets you back to your original mesh shape. And of course what will happen is that your joint compensation will now still, of course, function as it normally would on top of that morph. Joints also have this other wonderful little thing here called twist. In this case I would activate it on this deformer here, the first one, set it to say 100%. Then when this joint turns, in this case on its bank, you see that the amount of twist is distributed back up this deformer toward the parent. That in this case is what the percentage does. How far along the chain does the twist deformation get distributed? It's interesting to note here, you'll see that that only happened when I turned on bank. Really, we would expect that the twist, if this were twisting around the pitch here, that would let us control twist, hopefully, but it doesn't. How the twist axis works on joints is that it sort of binds, if you will, to whatever axis is running around the twist at the point where the bone's rest rotation is recorded. So in this case, that is indeed the bank, because at base pose, bind pose like this, it is the bank which is in line with the around, the around twistiness of the joint chain. However, it doesn't have to be so. Had I set up my pivot slightly different, such that heading was the twist around, you would see that the twist would then operate off of heading. And even though bank is now my bend here, say, you will notice that in spite of that fact, the joint compensation methods are still working on the bank axis. This helps us illustrate something of the kind of thinking that needs to go into using joints. For instance, let us imagine that this were an arm. We have the upper arm here, and we want that to be able to, twist and turn in the shoulder socket, but we really want that distribution of twist deformation to spread down toward the elbow. We then have this other lot of twist deformation that we want to spread down the forearm. What I could have in a situation like this is my heading and pitch to pose my shoulder thusly, but rather than turning it directly from there, or at least in the case of the deformation bones turning it directly from there, I could turn it here instead on the heading by, of course, arranging my base rotation axis in this way on the joints. That gives me my upper arm twist, but because the heading is the first axis, that still leaves me with my elbow always pointing in the correct direction, and it still leaves me with the opportunity to use twist on this end item as well, so as when that joint is grabbed and rotated, I've got a twist method available for distributing my twist deformation thusly. And that really is that. That is the story of joints and, of course, Z-axis bones in Lightwave. There's just one last little thing I'm going to point out, because you might have noticed it and wondered what's going on with this Maya style joints checkbox over here. Interestingly, this has nothing to do with joints, it actually has to do with Z bones. What we can notice with Z bones, and of course here I've just left those pivot recordings as I had them with the joints, is that their deformer portion is of course always down the Z-axis. It certainly looks a bit weird. What Maya style joints is for, as I said, nothing to do with joints, it's just a draw mode for Z bones. Turn it on for Z-axis bones and they look like joints. You'll even notice that when you select a given joint, the deformer portion above is highlighted with it. Don't let this confuse you. These do not behave anything like Lightwave joints. It's just a drawing style for Z-axis bones, and it has no bearing on how Z-axis bones work or deform or anything else. The deformation turnout is exactly the same whether you've got Maya style joints on or not. As such, Maya-style joints isn't really something you pretty much ever use in building your own rigs. Rather, it's for when you've brought in boned assets from outside, and using Z-axis bones, the deformers may not align to the parent-child hierarchy and the thing just looks like a mess. And there it is. Joints and bones, how they all work, how to get the different effects out of them, and how to use them and manage them properly within Lightwave.